Doug's kind of our Zoom guru, so I really depend on him, and I'm really grateful for what he does to help us with this. Our Zoom gathering for next month will be on Sunday, November 14th. And if you're on our list, you'll get that email reminder. Again, kind of a different topic. The topic is, who was Stanley? We're referring to the Welshman who found Dr. Livingstone in Africa. And so we're titling it From Denbigh to Knighthood, because he started his life in Denbigh in North Wales as a child of unmarried parents and ends up in knighthood and being quite a big part of the British presence in Africa. We're going to be hearing about that from a man named Toby Giese. Toby lives here in the Kansas City area. He's an amateur historian and author who's been studying this relationship with African history for some time. So we look forward to that. The other two events I'm going to share with you about are going to be more local, because we're going to venture into some in-person opportunities with the improvement of the pandemic situation. So on December 5th, we will have a rather traditional Christmas gathering at St. Luke's Episcopal Church in Shawnee, which those here locally will be aware of. And then our plans for 2022 are in the works. We're hoping, I have no guarantees on this, but we're hoping that we're going to be able to get Arturo Roberts, who was one of the founders of Nanai newspaper, to talk to us about Patagonia, the Welsh at the other end of the world. And then we're also going to try to attract a young woman who is a student at the Kansas State University, who is from Wales and plays soccer, to share about her experiences, both playing in Wales and playing in the United States for a university. Next year, we're also planning here in the Kansas City area to have a public concert on March 19th. The title of the concert is The Spirit Lives On, a feast of Welsh spirit and song. And what we're going to do is cover the musical expressions of the Welsh spirit from the time of the bards to the present day. And again, you'll hopefully be getting news about that. Hopefully you could be in the Kansas City area if you live away. Calgary, that might be a challenge, but you're still invited to come join us for that. So that's kind of what we're trying to do here in the Welsh Society of Kansas City. Today, I'm going to share with you about a Welshman that a lot of people don't know about, and I think it deserves some attention. So if you'll bear with me, let me bring up my wrong place. Where did it go? No, I apologize for this.
Oh, we see a map, Evan.
Okay, that's not what we need, though.
Okay.
I can't figure out.
You have a PowerPoint presentation?
Yeah, I've got the PowerPoint up here.
Okay. And we're looking at your, is that your that's your photos screen.
That's not doing it, is it?
You need to, from share your screen, you need to choose the monitor that your PowerPoint presentation is on.
Okay, just a minute, Doug. Trying to get up here to everything.
Okay. Do you have one or two?
All of a sudden, I seem to have lost it.
Do you have one or two monitors, Evan?
Just one.
Just one. Then what you need to do is just minimize the photos software and maximize your PowerPoint.
Gotcha. Okay, bear with me, everyone. I thought I had everything set up for us and it didn't happen.
That's okay. There's always something to mess you up.
Indeed.
Yeah.
As you all can tell, some of us don't make a living at this. I apologize again for the delay. Okay, is that showing?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
You need to share your screen.
Okay, bear with me here. I thought we had us ready. Oh, I thought we had us ready.
Okay. Okay, we're seeing your photo. Yeah, maximize your power.
What's that?
You've maximized your PowerPoint presentation. So now you go to slideshow and
Yes.
start
Is
the
it showing?
presentation. Yes.
Okay, all right. All right, let me go back. Sorry, everyone, for all of that. What I'm going to be talking about today is a man named Madoc Ab Awen Gwyneth. And Madoc is the Welsh of his name, where we hear Madoc is more of an anglicized version. And I want to begin by pointing out that this idea of a new world had been in people's imaginations in the European continent for a long time. In fact, Plato back in 800 BC was already talking about it in the Odyssey. And we know that there was a Greek named Piquet who found after a 6-week voyage that he landed someplace that could have been Iceland or it could have been the islands north of Scotland. We also have the story of St. Brendan, who supposedly left Ireland and made a voyage of 7 years into unknown waters. And it really challenged the way people thought about the new world that they thought could be out there, because he talked about it as filled with singing birds and trees filled with fruit. We also, of course, have the story of the Viking voyages that were certainly got to Iceland and Greenland. And there's evidence, of course, that they made it to the area of Newfoundland in Canada. What we don't maybe know about is that the Chinese actually ventured out. And there was a story of a monk who supposedly crossed the Pacific about 800 AD. I'm sorry, earlier than that, who may have reached Mexico because they find that there are similar images in Aztec culture that match those of China. But you notice who's missing? A man named Madoc, who set out from Wales back in 1170. Now, Columbus always seems to get all the credit. And I'm going to kind of challenge that today with our interest in Madoc. One of the things, I spent time in the Navy, so I can kind of relate to this. The sea is interesting because people who go to sea, they kind of create a relationship. And they learn a lot because the sea in many ways has always been looked at as a mystery. And so what happened was that one sailor learned something about out in the sea that he'd not heard about, he would share it with others. And this began to build the knowledge. Now, granted, some of the sharing might not have been very scholarly. It might have been them just sharing a bit of bragging over a bit of grog, or maybe just the fact that they're about to share a fearful voyage and they want to know more about it. And I'll give you a real powerful example from European experience. One of the ways that Jewish people survived the persecution of the Inquisition was by going to sea. And they became known as map makers and navigators. There was a term that is Italian based called Morenos. And that was sort of a negative term, but the fact was Columbus depended on a Jewish navigator, Luis de Torres, along with 4 other Morenos, to guide him on his journey in 1492. So in other words, there had been knowledge about the New World before that. Well, now we come to the question about our friend Madoc. It seems like the story about him really isn't uncovered very much because it was sort of done in a quiet way. And I'm going to kind of share his story with you today. Now, I got to tell you, I'm not a scholar. I'm a student. And what I'm going to share with you is just the result of my own individual personal study to kind of lay out the story of Madoc. And this story is not just my own. I'm going to borrow very much from other people. Whoop, excuse me. Madoc was born in Wales between Episcopal and Blaenau Festiniog, and he was a son of Prince Owain of the 12th century of North Wales. The story about his birth is very interesting because it has much Druidic content. Owain was very influential at his time. He had a large area that he managed. As you look at the map here and it shows Gwynedd, you see that it covers most of the part, except for Powys, of North Wales. And so his borders were really rather large and very remote. According to the tradition, Madoc was conceived under an aurora borealis, and that was a special sign for the Druids. They had a prophecy that Owain was going to have 3 sons born on the same night, to different mothers, obviously. Now, the first of the sons that would be born would be to one of the servants. His name would be David. The other one that was born to Owain's wife, Gladys, and that child died. The third child was our topic, Madoc, and he was born to a servant of Gladys. Her name was Brenda. So Owain, he was kind of a prolific character in his way. And what was interesting was that Madoc's name is a name that means explorer, but in this Druidic prophecy, he was going to be the savior of the Druids. And you have to realize that at this time, Owain and the people of Wales were kind of caught in this period where there was a great deal of Christianity going on in the face of their historic Druidic origin or orientation. And so the idea that Madoc was going to be savior of the Druids was based on the realization that he was going to find new lands where they could be. Now, what's interesting about Madoc is that he wasn't raised there in Gwynedd. If you're interested in reading, this is a novel, Circle of Stones, and it sort of tells a story about Madoc's mother, Brenda, and his childhood. And what we hear in this, among other things, is that he was fostered by his mother with relatives in Western Ireland to keep him safe. Now, fostering was a practice of the time where a lord would send off their youngest child and they would live with someone else, usually a family of less status. And that was where the child did their growing up and learned. And then they came back to join the family. I don't know if that meant the lords and ladies didn't want to bother raising kids or what that meant. They certainly didn't mind having them. but Madoc was fostered in this way. So what we also discover is that, again, Madoc, here you see kind of the genealogy for Owain, and we see Brenda listed here, but that's only because that's Madoc's mom. Gladys was his child, and you can see how many children he had. And under the Welsh law of Hwlda, if a father would claim their child as their child, whether they were a child of the wife of the Lord or not, that child was legitimate. And you can kind of see that with Owen's demise, how much conflict there would have to be in order for there to be succession to whatever the Lord had established. All the boys were acknowledged by Owain. And when he died in 1170, there was a huge dispute that broke out, and it was among the older boys. And what we learn is that Madoc really had no stomach for this. He didn't want to get into this. And so what he decided was he would set sail and he would take out for the Western Ocean with a small fleet of boats. And he collected together people. They left at the location called Ross on Sea and made their way out into the unknown world. Now, the question is, well, what kind of boat or ship did he use? Well, these are some examples of things people have done to give us some way to look at this. What you see here is the boat Kontiki. Some of us may remember a man named Thor Heyerdahl, who actually built a boat made with papyrus. And the idea was, as he was trying to imitate something that the Egyptians might have done. And he, in this reed raft, went from Tahiti, from Peru, using just the ocean currents of the Pacific. Other examples of similar efforts: in 1952, a man named Alan Bombard, he set out in a vessel that was only 14.5 feet long, made of 2 metal cylinders. Sounds like he was on one of those pontoon boat type things. And he crossed the Atlantic with a 6-foot mast and a sail to match. In 1966, the smallest craft to cross the Atlantic was 12 feet long, and it took 65 days. And 2 men rowed across from New York to the Sicily Islands, just southwest of England, in 1897. They did that in 55 days. So you can see what kind of effort and creativity it took for people to do this. In 1964, this Welshman, Val Howells, made a long voyage by himself from Pembrokeshire to Long Island. So obviously it's in the Welsh blood to try these things too. So these ideas of these voyages is not really kind of new. So that what Madoc was doing had some history. We know that because of his fostering, Madoc had knowledge from the Irish and other seamen that he would have learned about living on that west coast of Ireland. And he also learned of these things because part of his education growing up in Druidic studies would have exposed him to the stories of these earlier sailors that, like Plato and Brendan and the Norse discoveries, would have passed on. I know this is a very complicated map to look at. What it's suggesting to you are the natural ocean currents that exist around the world and sort of their flow. And they're not arbitrary, they're patterns, and they're patterns that are relatively stable, and they relate to certain land masses. And so as people learned about these, they were able to do them. If you were to use nature alone the ocean currents and favorable winds would give you a speed of about 14 knots. And so that would be about 16 miles an hour in our reference. So if you just sat still, the current would move you that far. These currents have been known to exist. They could carry an ancient vessel from Wales and Britain in such a manner. And if we look at this, we see it even more so. If you look at the dotted line, you get an idea of the kind of route that the Oceans would have taken Madoc and his group on to get to the New World. The early bards used to look down on seafarers. They thought they weren't dealing with reality because they were venturing out where things weren't supposed to be. And we know that there were other sailors among the Welsh. And we know that part of King Owain's or Prince Owain's dream for his rule that he would have a tradition of a Welsh fleet. And it wasn't something that materialized as fully. Welshmen were also known for their trading that involves seafaring. We think of trade with Ireland, Cornwall, Brittany, and the Sicily Islands to the south. So they had to have vessels of some kind that would have been within their capability. And we know that their use of vessels goes all the way back to the Roman times. So if you think about the kind of vessel that Madoc might have considered, we start with a very basic one, which is the coracle. And I trust you all are kind of familiar with this. A coracle is really kind of a lightweight boat, small, one man as a rule. The structure was made out of willow rods, and then they would cover it with an animal hide of some size. And then they would use tar derived from pine trees to waterproof it. You could see that they would be rather difficult to manage. I can't imagine going out into the ocean with one of these, but certainly that would have been in the realm of Madoc's consideration. I know the story of Brendan often suggests that this is what Brendan went out and sailed on. Another option is something that would have been from the Romans that the Welsh called the Piquet, and they used it, the Romans used it because it was fast and it was agile, and they used it to seek out intelligence information for their military actions along the coast. We find that there's writings of other ships available to the Welsh that could be manned by 60 men. And we know that seals of some of the Welsh towns along the shore show ships as some kind. And what's interesting is I'll mention later when we talk about Mexico, many of them had square sails. What has probably become more obvious is the idea that it might have been more of a Viking design that Madoc might have used. This is an example of the Osberg ship, which was resurrected and is found from the 9th century, which would have helped fit into that. The ships would have been built of wood from the forests around Naguinant in Carnarvonshire. And so shipbuilding was present along the west coast of Wales at this time. We also know that Madoc was sometimes described as the sailor magician, that he could create a ship that would not sink, and that he was wise in the knowledge of the sea and their temper and deceits. This is a quote. The magic ship, the one that he's given most credit from, was made with staghorn joining the boards together rather than with nails, believing that that made it more seaworthy. And the ship was called the White Horn. We believe that his brother Rued went with him on these trips and helped with the construction of the boat. Now, there actually are two voyages. The first one was in 1170. He departed from a location around Clandero, and the legend says that there wasn't any evidence to show that that's where it was. However, construction was started in 1950s and was discovered there was an ancient seawall, which is suspected to be the place where he would have laid out. We also know that this seawall was possibly a seafront for many of the Welsh shipping in that area. There is a black book that's called the Black Book of the Admiralty. It was from the 12th and 13th centuries that actually recorded the name of the White Horn, his boat, which tends to, again, solidify the fact that there's a basis to his setting out. His initial journey took him in touch with the European continent, as we saw when we look back on the map. Here we go. You'll see how it came down along the shore there past the Azores, and it picked up the current that took it across. And it took him into an area in the Gulf of Mexico. The place that we're going to see that where there's the most evidence that he landed in North America is at Mobile Bay, Alabama. That there was probably several other places that he landed before they settled there, but that they eventually just stopped there, and that was where they decided to make their home on land. They ran into no opposition at first, which may explain why they didn't stop and settle sooner, because there was more to see. And they weren't looking for conflict. They weren't there. See, one of the distinctions I might make between Madoc and Columbus, for example, is Columbus was coming to take something from the land, which would be our forerunner for colonization in the North America and South America. The Welsh were just looking for a new home. And so they weren't interested in conflict. They weren't interested in dominating people. And what's interesting about this location at Mobile Bay is that the meaning of their accomplishment was taken up by the Daughters of the American Revolution. And they actually created this plaque. And I know it's hard to see because I couldn't get it clearer, but it was erected at Fort Morgan in Mobile Bay in 1953. The plaque reads, "In memory of Prince Madoc, a Welsh explorer who landed on the shores of Mobile Bay in 1170 and left behind with the Indians the Welsh language." There was an effort to take the plaque down. It was thrown into storage, but the ladies of the Daughters of American Revolution were really stubborn. And in fact, they had a campaign. And I know that several members of our chapter of the Welsh Society were among those who signed the petition to bring it out and put it in place. The choice of Mobile Bay for landfall probably has a couple things to do. One was the ocean current. The second and more convincing reason that we have for why they probably were there is that there are a series of hill forts built up the Alabama River that are pre-Columbus. And the fact that a tradition has been handed down through the Cherokee people of the white people who built these hill forts. We have testimony that goes back to 1810 from the governor of Tennessee. And I'm kind of avoiding all the names because that's probably of less interest to you today. But he recounts a conversation he had with Onkensota, who was a Cherokee chief who was 90 years old back in 1782. And he had been the ruling chief of the Cherokee people for 60 years. And this is what the chief said. He heard his grandfather and father say they were a people called Welsh, and they had crossed the great water and landed first near the mouth of the Alabama River and had been driven up the heads of the water until they arrived at Hiwassee River, which is further up in the watershed. When asked if he'd ever heard what nation they belonged to, again, he reaffirmed Welsh. And the leader of these people was Madoc in the Cherokee language. And so, again, this affirmation that these white people had this presence back in that period of time is pretty remarkable. Here are some of the sites where we will find, I'm sorry, this is Oconsoda, the one that was recording this history. The first fort we'll notice is at a place called Lookout Mountain. It's in Alabama. It's laid out, interestingly enough, in a setting and a method of construction that mirrors the castle where Madoc was born. Historian James Piquet records this: on the banks of the river bordering on this peninsula are the same unbroken rock walls which form the falls and are equally high and bold. And then across the peninsula are yet to be traced two ancient ditches. Now, I don't know if you've had a chance to ever explore what these old hill forts were that the Brythonic Celts and the Welsh built, but typically they were on high places, and for defensiveness, they always built ditches around them as a way to thwart anyone who might try to invade them. They talk about these structures in the middle of the curve that they form. Although the ditches have been filled on by the effects of time, their inner sides are rock piled up and mixed with dirt to make these entrenchments. And then he goes on into much more detail about this particular location. You had to pass along a rock passage that was only wide enough for one man to be able to get into it. A few persons in the first rock house with swords or spears could keep off an army of 1,000 men. This is the historian describing this site. Now, most of the rocks that were observed by Piquet back there in 1850 were the ruins of this type of structure. The one we're looking at right now is the ruin from the castle where Madoc would have been born. The second site shows that they migrated some. They went to Fort Mountain, which is in western Georgia. It's presumed that there probably did develop enough hostility with the Welsh that they had to move on. So this is the next site that we know about. Again, very similar type of construction, a hill fort. We see that these are the kind of remains that you find today, unnatural collections of rocks that would have been part of the structures they would have built. The findings indicate that this location predates even the Cherokees who were living there in the 1700s. I mean, this is really old history. Another example, again, I wish the photos were better quality, but this is another example of one of those rock walls built on the hill, which would have been classic. And here we see a diagram of what is showing here. Again, we see the trenches, and we see both the mix of the old and the new. The Cherokees called the wall builders moon-eyed people because they could see better at night than by day, which I find kind of curious observation. They were said to have fair skin, blonde hair, and blue eyes. Again, there's a plaque there that commemorates it as the people called the Welsh. and they had built a fort on the mountain long ago to repel Indian attacks. This is our third location along the way. As they moved up, you'll notice that they're moving away from Mobile Bay. They're kind of moving up towards the Ohio River, using the Tennessee Valley watershed as kind of their route. Again, this is another one of those locations. It still has remnant signs of what they built. Again, we have a hill location, well laid out to defend itself. And again, more evidence that the Welsh left their mark. So you kind of see here on this map the kind of trail of what they were following, using the water as their way to move up to the north. Sorry. And we'll learn more about that later. The trail of these settlers, again, is related in the tribal history of the Cherokee. And there was a relationship with the Cherokee that must have been positive. They went finally up to the Ohio River, and up the Ohio to the Missouri, and then up the Missouri. And as it was quoted, they went a great distance, for they are no more white people. They are now all become Indians. And that's because there was a coming together of these two peoples with intermarriage and offspring and so on. We even find that this presence of Welsh people is noted. Welsh travelers learned of it from the Native Americans. We find all kinds of little signs among things that finally got written down. This chief Okanastota seems to have been kind of someone who he talked about the bearded Indians and this trek of going up the river. This is another location which shows signs as they approach the Ohio. This is in Indiana. And again, you see the same kind of terrain with the ditches around for protection. This is called Devil's Backbone, and it's on the Ohio River. At these different kind of sites, we find that there's other evidence too. For example, early explorers in this area found 6 skeletons encased in brass armor that was bearing the Welsh coat of arms. Now, Madoc wasn't content just to do the group he brought. He left 120 people at Mobile Bay, and he went back to Wales. And again, the ocean currents would have carried him along the eastern shore of the United States, which meant he likely touched people along the way as they went back for a second group of settlers. He prepared to come back on a second voyage with 10 ships. It's not known exactly where he would have departed. We know that he did stop on the island of Lundy, which is pictured here. And it's actually kind of in the Bristol Channel near Devonshire. And we know that he had earlier contact with Lundy. About 7 years before that, his father, Owain, actually met representatives of the British, Henry II. And this has been acknowledged by the local people that Madoc actually stopped there. As he returned to the Mobile Bay, somehow they all got lost. The second group never showed up, so they had to have been lost at sea. These brave souls would never be heard of again. Now, what we do know, again, here's a site of Lundy Island as it might have looked when Madoc left. We do know that records of this are found in a lot of other places. We find that the name Madoc shows up in some Spanish, French, and other references. Native peoples of Virginia and then south to Guatemala spoke of a hero named Madoc, M-A-T-E-C, or Mateo, to Columbus. So it was kind of like, whoa, what's going on here? These kind of things were curious to them because they found that, like, for example, when De Soto was exploring Mexico and Alabama, it kind of wondered what was going on because he found these fortified hills. And it was kind of disturbing, like, what was all of this about? So the sites of Madoc's activity were found in Mexico and Alabama. The people talked about the gente blanco, which is the white people. And it was like they'd all known about this in advance before Columbus. It's been claimed that part of the emphasis on this, and this is a map of the United States or North America with the different countries' interests. And the English interest was here along the eastern shore. In 1580, Queen Elizabeth I stated in a royal title, "The Lord Madoc, son of Owen Gwynedd, Prince of North Wales, led a colony and inhabited in Terra Florida or thereabouts in 1170." So in other words, the first Queen Elizabeth actually acknowledged that Madoc had gone there. Now, part of the suspicion is she did that to help strengthen the English claim to North America. People like the Spanish doubted this because they couldn't see that as enough justification for the British to hold this part of the world. Well, we have an interesting element here because there are also signs that Madoc may have been led by the waters over to Mexico first. And that contact kind of showed up in some things. For example, if you look here, you'll see some words that match Welsh that is found in the language of the ancient occupants of Mexico. We find Corosio is this island off the coast that sounds like Croeso. They have a river called Gwendur, which sounds like white water, Gwendir, and so on down the line. It was kind of like, well, how come? Why are these words like this? And when Cortez came, he talked about their stories of a strange race from across the sea that they said in a speech by Montezuma, "We came from a generation very far in a little island in the north. The language and religion continue here today." And that would be the Druidic religion he's talking about. And he went on to say, "The white men came from a quarter where the sun rose beyond the ocean." These records go on to say that the great being who once ruled over this land had declared on his departure that he would return one day. And actually, it was that belief that allowed the native people of Mexico to be so open to the Spaniards at first without fear, because they thought it was the white person coming again who had been there before. In the Aztec legend of Quetzalcoatl, wrong Quetzalcoatl. And this, we have a depiction of him. He's described as white with a beard. It said that he stopped the Mexicans from offering blood sacrifices, taught them instead to offer bread and flowers. Relics of these things have been found, and it's as if Aztecs believed that these white people had been there before. One of the things in our history that I think is worth really noting is about the concept of the Welsh Indians. The Welsh-related population in the United States in 1965 numbered 2.5 million people. Today it's greater. But the influx began with the first colonies and initially ran through the 17th century. prominent Welsh descendants brought an interest in their Welsh. And Thomas Jefferson is a key example. His relatives were from Snowdonia, and he was really very driven by his heritage. He also reached out to another man with a Welsh heritage, Meriwether Lewis. I trust you know that name. He was the one who joined with William Clark on the Lewis and Clark expedition that went west across North America. And one of the things that President Jefferson asked them to do is look for the Welsh Indians. It's in their instructions. It was believed that there were such things. For example, a Reverend Morgan Jones in 1686 wrote, as he experienced himself as a prisoner of the Doag Indians in North Carolina, that when they heard him speak in Welsh, the Sachem, that would be the holy man, came to him and freed him, speaking all the while to Jones in the Welsh language. He was entertained in their village for 4 months where they conversed freely in Welsh. Can you imagine that? Being a prisoner of a Native American group and to find out they speak your language? That would have been remarkable. We have another example where the same thing happened again, this time with a spy from the American Revolution who wrote likewise that with this tribe, they could speak Welsh. There are similar stories. There's one of a sailor who was shipwrecked and came and washed ashore between Virginia and Florida. He spoke too about Indians who spoke a language similar to Welsh. We have countless examples. I won't go through it. Sir Walter Raleigh found Welsh-like phrases among the tribes, like in the Indian language, Yakitha. Can you imagine what that would have been like to come among these people? We have other examples all along the way, and I just won't go through all of those with you for now. The evidence of the Welsh Indians just continue to be fed by this, along with Jefferson and other people's interest in it. When Catholic missionaries went among some of the tribes, they learned about white Indians. And these they found among the Iowas, the tribe of the Middle West Plains. They found people who were fair-haired, white-skinned, especially among the women, which is kind of interesting. In 1735, the French explorer Le Vérendrye had his first encounter with the Mandan Indians. The tribe at the time resided up in North Dakota on the Missouri River. And the tribe was rather large. It had a rather prominent role. If anything, it was a place where tribes would suspend any of their conflict and come for trading. And he described that they were an unusual tribe because they had blue-eyed people. And their skin was lighter, it was fair, and their hair was blonde, red, and brown. And he found it interesting because they were growing beards, which was not common among Native Americans. And it was just like, they're as white men with forts and towns and permanent villages laid out in streets and squares. They were building homes made of logs. They cultivated fields. In other words, it was like he could see a similarity to something that you would see maybe in Wales. The Mandan chief told him that the tribe's ancestors had formerly lived much farther south. Well, that would coincide with what we know about the Welsh migration. They had once dwelt at the mouth of 3 rivers on the Gulf of Mexico, and they'd been driven north on up the upper Missouri. And likewise, the Mandan language was peppered with Welsh words. And let me get down here. Guess what they did when they went out into the water? They had coracles. The other thing that was interesting was the Mandan treasured these blue beads. Now, that might not seem like much, but they were blue glass beads. They were the kind that were used, that were made on the island of Lundy. In fact, Lewis and Clark lamented that they had not brought more blue beads with them because the Indians prized those much above the red ones. And every Mandan village harbored what he called a holy canoe. It was made out of red cedar, and they had ceremonies around it. The shrine was dedicated to the lone white man who had brought the Mandans in his big canoe from across the great water. We see here the trip that they could have used to by water to eventually end up as the Mandans. From down here at Mobile Bay and up the rivers to go up. In the late 1790s, there was an upsurge of interest in Wales and this story of Madoc, and there were these persistent rumors of the Welsh Indians that were driving everyone. And there are countless stories about how people tried to follow that. One was a man named, we get the name right, John Evans. And he was born in Carnarvon in 1770, and he migrated over, and he was doing some of these explorations. And he went from St. Louis and he continued on up the river. His expedition was backed by the Spanish. They wanted to know if there was anything to be worried about. And he found the Mandans, as was earlier mentioned. At the time, he didn't find any Welsh speakers among them. And he had traveled 1,800 miles, and in doing so, he found a map. But I think Evans was motivated to please the Spanish. We see, and again, this is a very bad photo of the actual map that he made of the rivers and where the Indians were. And he died in 1799, prior to this. But Thomas Jefferson, again, we come back to that and how he sent Lewis and Clark out to look for them. The map that they used to help had been the one prepared by John Evans. Lewis and Clark made observations. Lewis took down words and so on, and had actually documented some of this similarity in the Welsh language. However, he died shortly after they got back to St. Louis, and that information never got to be used. But it's known that among these people, the Mandans, and then a tribe just further west of them, which is the Flathead Indians, again, there were these presences of fair skin and being handsome. George Catlin was another one who captured for us in visual form things that were of the Mandans. Again, he found the similarities among the Welsh. He found the similarities between the language. We see here, among other things, some of the same things where the language is so similar. You'll notice down here that even in the word of Great Spirit, Madoc is a word that is used as a synonym for that. When he left them, he had no doubt that they had been a people that had somehow survived a transatlantic voyage, had survived the Cherokee, had survived an 1,800-mile migration. They'd even managed to survive the Sioux. What would wipe out that nation and any hope of developing the Welsh Indian concept was smallpox. And the tribe was wiped out in 1837. Currently, DNA studies are going on. What they're trying to do is get access to bodies of people within, say, the Cherokee people. They've also found an ally and a Shawnee wisdom keeper named Ken Lone Wolf. And they're doing these studies to try to find out if they can establish it. Lone Wolf himself shows that he has a female ancestor who's Welsh, but they can't prove where he got it. So it continues to keep the question going. The theory that sometimes gets forth again is the one I mentioned earlier, that all of this is fiction, that it was something contrived by the British to give them some kind of authority over the New World. But early Celtic narratives talk about these things. You find references in the stories of Norse discoverers, voyagers who themselves made it here. And so my argument is that I think there's evidence of Madoc, and I think that October 11th deserves a new name. Instead of Columbus Day, it should be Madoc Day. I know the Native Americans would welcome it because it's a much more friendly message. Thank you for your patience through all that. I entertain questions if you just want to speak up and
Evan, at this point, yeah.
there we go, got it.
We can all see each other now.
How many people were with Madoc? Someone asked. Well, he left 120 supposedly when he went back to Wales for the second voyage. Again, we don't know how many would have actually been there. We just don't have that. Susan asked the question, how many sea miles did he travel to get to Long Island? Well, he didn't go to Long Island. That was the other gentleman. I don't know. Does anybody offhand have a guess about the distance across the Atlantic? I never got past Bermuda, so I don't have an answer for you. Anything anyone would like to share? You just have to unmute is all.
Evan, did you have any one book or source that was kind of?
Yeah, there were a number of them, both online and in books. There is obviously in Mobile, Alabama, there's a lot of emphasis on this piece of history for themselves. And I tried to reach out to a gentleman who I would have hoped could have taken my place and done more. I think it's just one of those things that there is a book. I don't have it. I'd have to go dig it out.
Okay.
Doug, but what I can do is I'll send out an email with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
We can also post it on YouTube.
Yeah, we can do that.
I have a question.
Please.
Is there any evidence that shows that Madoc had any children?
It didn't come up. No, nothing I've read indicated that at all.
That's a shame.
Yeah, that would have helped. Yeah, that just doesn't seem to come up in the story. He's always sort of portrayed as a hero, and that didn't seem to be a part of the story. No, I don't know. Yeah. Given the way his father acted, he probably would have had an adversity to it. I don't know.
Possible, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was sure glad to have all of you join with me. I hope it was something that you learned a little bit about. Again, I advocate for Madoc Day. I guess I see there's a movement on to call the day Indigenous People Day as a way to recognize the reverse of. I think one thing I would note is that the story of Madoc shows a way we can relate to people that are different by living with them and seeing where it takes us. Where I think what Columbus did, he came with economic interests. And we have the tale of colonialism and its effect on Native peoples that sadly reduce people to objects of worth rather than fellow children of God, if you will. I think the Welsh tried to live with the people from the stories that we have. And I think there's an example for us there. Well, if there's no questions or anything, I want to thank you all for joining us. Be sure to chime in for us.
David, did you have a question?
David?
I just wanted to thank you for all the work you put into the presentation, and very interesting. And I was making a few notes here, and we'll continue, my
Good.
own kind of digging into it.
Sure, sure. Yeah. Well, David, thank you so much. I don't think the Welsh Indians got up to Canada, however, I'm sorry.
Well, you don't
You never know.
I worked up in the Northwest Territories, in the subarctic.
Ah, yes.
For 37 years with First Nations people.
Uh-huh.
And it was interesting because when I heard them learn their counting, one was Inche, one place. And I thought, oh my gosh, a bit of Madoc up here too. But that was,
you never know.
That was the only comparison.
That observation, I didn't get into all the detail that I encountered, but among the, in Mexico, there was that similarity between Welsh numbers and their numbers as well. So that's a curious connection. Yeah. Yeah.
Dad, I do have another question.
What do we have?
I have one more question.
Yes.
Do you know if school children in Wales are taught the history of Madoc?
I don't know. It seems like it would be good.
I didn't know if anyone here today grew up in Wales and knows personal experience.
David, do you know something of that perhaps?
I never, well, I was, had all my education in Wales and, excuse me, I didn't hear of Madoc actually until I was over in Canada. So there you go.
Interesting.
Yeah. The other thing that I'd like to mention too, and you've already kind of touched on it, and that is that one of the things we need to do is begin to understand the truths about the native cultures in North America. And that too should be a part of the education of all young North Americans.
I agree.
In order to understand some of the challenges that they still exist for them today, was something that has a consequence on the way that they were treated over the years in the States and in Canada.
Yes. For those of you that don't know, I'm a retired Episcopal priest, and part of my experience was with the Winnebago people of Nebraska. And during that time, I was doing graduate work in gerontology. So it gave me an opportunity to look into what it meant to be an older Nebraska Winnebago, and I wrote a paper on it. And this was in the 1970s. And I knew at that time that their life was a bit chaotic because they were old enough to have had experience with their grandparents who were able to teach them some things of their language and their culture and experience that. but they also were the ones that were sent, especially the boys, were sent to boarding schools. And at the same time, in the 1970s, Wounded Knee had just happened. So we had this emergence of awareness of culture and how amazing it was that things were upside down for them. It was interesting because typically men were the teachers historically, and yet the children were taught the Winnebago language from women. The tribal chairman was from the Snake clan, which is the lowest of the 12, which was contrary to the structure of their culture. And so it was a very curious time. David, I appreciate knowing that you also worked with First Nations people. Have we any other things to share? If not, I'd like to again thank you all for coming. You're always welcome to join us. And God be with you and have a good Sunday. And I trust we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Evan. Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thanks so much, Evan.
You're welcome.
Flipped in that locker room that led to this type of win. I think guys is going to be on the, we do not.